How many years we've been doing it, but it's a big tradition here in the history department. Every 2 years we do this. And my name is Kelsey Sackstetter. I'm the resident ancient historian, hence my presence at this panel. And we've got three great talks for you today. Unfortunately, Dr. William Bubelis, our first scheduled speaker, had an emergency and is unable to attend, even virtually. So he has sent me his paper, so if you will bear with me, I will read it, and then I will provide his email address. If anybody has questions for him, you can contact him directly about whatever it is that you would like to discuss. So I think is there an email directory for the attendees? Or should I just, okay. In the event that you have questions for Dr. Bubelis, his email is WB as in boy, UBELIS at WUSTL.edu. Okay, so that's Dr. Bubelis from Washington University at St. Louis. And his paper is entitled Without Parallel, Bifurcated Duty in the Missions of Athens' Sacred Triremes. Since perhaps the early 5th century BC, the city-state, or polis, of Athens maintained two special vessels known as sacred triremes apart from the regular fleet. How these two triremes related to one another has remained obscure, but scholars have long assumed that they operated in parallel or were interchangeable. In this paper, I argue that Athens employed the ships for some fundamentally distinct duties, notwithstanding their common military service as elite warships for use on special missions. While the size of the fleet fluctuated over time, ranging from as low as a dozen ships to nearly 400, one constant was the presence of two ships that operated above and apart from the regular fleet, and yet fought alongside those other vessels. These two ships, known as sacred triremes, operated along different lines from all other vessels in the fleet, yet in parallel with one another in several respects. First, the two lines of ships were, in principle, each named after patron deities. Thus, until a critical set of naval reforms in 363-2, the two vessels were the Paralos and the Salaminia. The eponymous hero Paralos was an important nautical hero who possessed a shrine and received sacrifices, whereas the Salaminia poses a problem because its name cannot refer to any of the gods or heroes associated with the island of Salamis. Strictly speaking, the name should be identical or nearly so with the name of a patron god or hero, but there's no known deity that can be called Salaminia. Many scholars have assumed that the Salaminia was named after Athens' great naval victory at Salamis over the Persians in 480, but it has not been possible to reconcile that hypothesis with the general pattern that we see in the Paralos and in the Salaminia's own successor. In 363-2, the Salaminia was retired, and in its place was commissioned the Amonas, named for the oracular Egyptian god Ammon, who possessed thereafter a major shrine at Athens' principal port, the Piraeus. These names were attached to every new hull in the line that was put in service to replace the prior one. The crew was named in concert with the ship and its god, so that each crew member of the Paralos was also called a Paralos, and the crew was known collectively as Paraloi, just as if a ship named in a later age, for the sake of argument, after St. Christopher, had crew that might be known as St. Christophers, and each member thereof in his own right also a St. Christopher. This was also true of the Salaminia, whose crew was known as the Salaminioi, and while there was nothing like this in the rest of the Athenian military structure, naval or terrestrial, to say nothing of Greeks more broadly, the lack of patron deity is a troubling problem, or rather a clue about the nature of this particular ship. Second, until the naval reforms of 363-2, command of each vessel was entrusted to an officer known as a trierarch, who performed this duty exclusively by virtue of being a special kind of taxpayer known as a liturgist. When allocated this duty by the generals, the liturgist was required to use his own wealth, frequently at punishing levels of cost, both to hire the crew and also to provide for the ship's equipment and outfitting above and beyond what the polis provided, and that includes base pay for the rowers. On maneuvers or in combat, the trierarchs came under the authority of whatever general or generals the Athenians had assigned. There were, in essence, no standing naval officers, and it was the generals who annually assigned the trierarchies to the wealthy and able of Athens, though subject to legal dispute. The vessels were built and otherwise maintained by the polis at its own expense. Use of a trierarch was standard throughout the regular Athenian fleet and remained so after 363-2, but it was in that year that the Athenians replaced the trierarchs of the sacred triremes with an officer known as a tamias, or a steward of holy objects. Indeed, each tamias was elected by the Athenian people, just like the generals and a few other military officers, in contrast to the hundreds of other officials who were chosen by random allotment from available and qualified volunteers. Moreover, the tamii were probably free from the financial responsibilities of regular trierarchs. Why a tamias, as a religious magistrate of the polis, should be in command of the vessel arises from the religious dispensation of the ships and crews, as I've already discussed, but election ensured that only experienced military officers could be trusted with this command. Major Athenian temples typically possessed tamii who guarded the contents of those shrines, often of enormous monetary and religious value, and also stewarded their use in important rituals. That same task befell the tamii of the sacred triremes, since each ship was tied to a god or hero, complete with shrine, valuable ex votos, and religious ritual equipment, and a calendar of sacrifices that the officers and crew had the obligation and privilege of performing. Thus, the third area, where the sacred triremes paralleled one another but were distinct from the regular fleet, is that where the trierarchs hired the regular ship crews as needed, and given that the sailing season was typically confined to the warmer months of the year, those crews had no religious attachment to each other or to their ships. The crews of the sacred triremes were employed throughout the whole of the year, including the winter, were paid at a higher rate, and were composed solely of Athenian citizens, while the regular fleet made use of foreigners and slaves in significant numbers. Thus, the two sacred triremes differed from the rest of the fleet in another way. Namely, that their crews had the ability, and indeed were expected, to perform with the highest level of nautical skill and strength, even in the worst of conditions at sea, and to do so with the highest level of devotion to the polis itself, and by extension, the democracy as its form of government. Notwithstanding how similar the vessels were to one another, and yet distinct from the rest of the fleet, there does exist a major difference between the Salaminia and the Paralos that has long gone unnoticed. The problem is that the Athenians recognized several degrees or levels of sanctity, and that the highest of these was incompatible with certain legal duties, namely the extradition of those accused of or condemned for crimes such as murder that spread ritual pollution to others, duties exclusively and strongly attested for the Salaminia alone. Ritual pollution, or miasma, was a phenomenon that was as important to the Athenians as it remains difficult to define beyond a few key actions or identities that were thought to generate it. The intentional killing or wounding of another was one of the sources of miasma. Another was impiety, namely an aggressive offense against a god or against religious sentiment. However deep-founded and inexpressible Athenian thought on miasma was, the Athenian approach also possessed a legal dimension of equal significance that depended entirely upon the decisions of those in a position to judge the guilt or innocence of a person accused of the relevant crimes. In other words, if a man was found innocent through the proper institutions, then he was indeed considered free of miasma. Judgment for the various kinds of homicide and assault enjoyed a robust institutional apparatus that placed sole responsibility, indeed obligation, for prosecution on the closest male relatives of the victim, but within a framework of magistrates and procedures that ensured due process and thereby provided legitimacy to the judgment itself. Thus, aggrieved family members of the victim prosecuted, but it was the polis that actually judged, usually through the agency of mass juries composed of fellow citizens, and it was the polis alone that carried out any sentence imposed upon the condemned. But until judgment could be appropriately rendered, the accused, however innocent he might be, had to be treated as a person who might be polluted, and therefore in a position to contaminate others. Yet, because the accused had to be judged somehow, while the jurors and magistrates had to be spared the possibility of being polluted by being under the same roof as the accused, the Athenians built some of their homicide courts to be enclosed by walls and yet open to the sky. Likewise, for those who dared not to go into exile but risked trial instead, the guilty were executed and refused burial in Athenian soil. Even those who were legally condemned after their death had their remains thrown across the Athenian boundaries, or possibly into the sea. In any case, Athens itself was not to be contaminated by those who were believed to have violated its most sacred laws. The same principles likely applied to naval vessels whenever their service brought them into contact with those accused of crimes bearing the taint of miasma. Contamination was unavoidable given the design of the vessels alone, to say nothing of the deep-seated belief that all on board were put at greatest risk by the presence of a guilty person. That contact would arise at any point where a naval vessel was either required to transport such a person or discovered them in the course of its duties. Given the high frequency with which Athens prosecuted all such crimes involving miasma, and the numerous instances of Athenians who fled into exile rather than risk execution, it is highly likely that the Athenian fleet would indeed either chance upon such men by accident in the course of its normal missions, or be required to transport such men to Athens when held by an ally. I will point out now that it is the latter situation, transport assignments, that most concerns us here. Let us turn to the case of the general Sabaidis, arguably both the single greatest military figure in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, but notorious for his personal behavior. In 415-4, as the Athenians were about to embark on a major expedition against Sicily, it was discovered that many leading citizens had engaged in one or both of several acts of outrageous impiety, considered so offensive as to endanger the expedition and the survival of Athens itself. Among those strongly implicated was Alcibiades, but it was Alcibiades who had persuaded the Athenians to undertake the Sicilian expedition and had thus been appointed as one of the 3 generals in command. Thus, Alcibiades was not detained in Athens prior to the expedition's departure, and it was only once he was in Sicily and overseeing operations there that the Athenians resolved to bring him to trial at home. For that purpose, the Athenians dispatched a sacred trireme, which the contemporary historian Thucydides, himself an Athenian general in exile, specifies was the Salaminia. And it is from the custody of that vessel that Alcibiades would escape while en route. It may be of some interest that Alcibiades did not embark on the Salaminia, but rather sailed unguarded on his own recognizance in a vessel of his own and used that to make his escape. Because Thucydides names the Salaminia as the vessel for the express and sole purpose of bringing the accused back home to Athens for trial, we cannot doubt the commitment of the Athenians to bring Alcibiades to trial. The crew's loyalty to the democracy was as famous as its ability to complete its missions. But what is important here is that Thucydides evidently wished to avoid confusing his audience, since that audience, I suggest, will have known that the Athenians possessed 2 sacred triremes and that they were not interchangeable. In a pair of entries, the Byzantine lexicographer Pollux thus delineates the difference between the Paralos and the Salaminia, namely that it arose from a difference in their sanctity, and by extension, whatever religious missions they could or could not undertake. Quote, Paralos, sacred trireme, as is also the Salaminia. But the Paralos was dispatched for sacred embassies, both, I state, to Delos and Olympia, whereas the Salaminia was sent to bring back those outside of Attica itself who were believed to have committed a crime. These triremes also, nonetheless, fought in war. B. Paralos, sacred ship, ship of sacred embassies. The Greek is theoris, and the other was the Salaminia. So sacred embassies constituted delegations sent by one community to conduct sacrifices at a major shrine in another community, usually in conjunction with games at which athletes competed for divine honor, of which the most recognizable instance is that of the ancient Olympics. Since the Paralos alone was designated for transport of sacred embassies, and the Salaminia is only added to the general list of sacred triremes, the Paralos clearly enjoyed a higher level of sanctity than the Salaminia. We may infer from the famous example of Socrates in 399-8 that the sacred embassies were fundamentally incompatible with acts that might potentially bring some miasma, even the legally ordained execution of a criminal. Socrates' execution was delayed until a sacred ship, not one of these triremes, but another kind used solely to transport embassies to the sacred island of Delos, returns to Athens from its mission. Once docked, the vessel gave up its heightened level of sanctity, and the execution could and did proceed. Thus, we should have recognized at face value what these texts had long been telling us, namely that the Paralos had sacred missions of greater sanctity than the Salaminia, and therefore that for all of their similarities, the only function that these 2 vessels are known to have shared is simply their common military one. But there is still one outstanding crux. If even the Salaminia was a sacred trireme, as indeed our sources state, and yet lacked distinct cultic focus of god and shrine, what made it sacred at all? We have no good answer to the question, because we do not possess much, if any, evidence for the Salaminia conducting rituals or being otherwise responsible for some or another sacred mission. Our sources state that the Salaminia was one of the sacred triremes, but do not tell us what specifically made it sacred. Perhaps new discoveries will provide the answer. In conclusion, nonetheless, it is likely that the Salaminia was thus likely named only for the naval victory that Athens won over the Persian fleet in 480, and indeed never possessed a patron deity. Let me suggest that the bifurcation in the duties of the Salaminia and Paralos arose as an accident of their different historical development. The Salaminia preceded the Paralos's creation by as much as a half century, and that when first commissioned, the Salaminia was sacred enough for the Athenians to earn that designation as the proudest ship in the fleet. But when the Paralos was commissioned, sometime later in the 5th century, to judge by available evidence, the Paralos was endowed with greater religious importance. So much so that it set the standard for what a sacred trireme should be. By 363-2, I suggest the Athenians felt that it was time to commission a vessel fully parallel to the Paralos, and since the Salaminia could never have a patron deity, because its name could neither be altered, nor could a god with enough importance be created or discovered with the right name, the Athenians had no choice but to retire it and make way for an entirely new vessel. When the Athenians retired the Salaminia in 363-2 and commissioned in its place a new vessel, the Ammonias, that was the full equal of the Paralos in religious terms, they also terminated the bifurcation that had long characterized their sacred triremes. Only after this date can we thus speak of the two sacred triremes as truly interchangeable and parallel in duty. Again, that is the paper of Dr. William Boubelis from Washington University at St. Louis. I will refer any questions you may have to him. Again, his email is wbubelis, WBUBELIS, at wustl.edu.
Well-read paper.
Thank you. If anybody has questions about like the historical circumstances surrounding these events, I can answer those, but the specific arguments about the sacred triremes, I leave that in Dr. Boubelis' hands. So, are there any general questions about the events that he was referring to here? Okay.
What did Sabaidis do that was so, and the rest of the community before the invasion of Sicily?
I was hoping somebody would ask that. Oh, okay. So there were two events of sacrilege that were alleged. One of them was spoofing the Eleusinian mysteries, which is a mystery rite. It's a mystery religion sacred to the goddess Demeter at Eleusis, which is about 14 miles northwest of Athens. And I mean, this is serious business. It's like if we discovered somebody with the stature of a Winston Churchill performing a black mass or something like that. And Alcibiades and his ne'er-do-well buddies were implicated in that. The other thing is that the city of Athens was dotted with these statues sacred to the god Hermes. They're called Herms, obviously. And they're a little strange to our sensibilities. They are a pillar with a head and a phallus. That's it. Hermes was the god of, among other things, travel. And on the eve of the expedition, in what I like to think of as the Athenian equivalent of taking baseball bats to mailboxes, somebody went and vandalized all of the city's Herms. So the sacred statues of the god of travel were destroyed on the eve of the largest naval expedition Athens had ever launched. So Alcibiades, again, was implicated in that. So there were two different charges of sacrilege there. You're welcome. Anything else? Yes?
Good question. Was it common for Greeks to name their ships after gods outside of the Greek pantheon? Because I think that they're going to talk about they named it after.
Yeah, the Zeus Ammon. So the thing with Zeus Ammon is that he was he was an amalgamation of the Greek god Zeus and the Egyptian god Ammon, whose symbol was the ram. And it was sort of like the oracle at Delphi. The oracle of Zeus Ammon had an international reputation. And so the Greeks sort of were able to claim him as part of their pantheon because there was this relationship, and it was a site of pilgrimage for people in the Greek-speaking world. It's actually where Alexander the Great made a pit stop when he was conquering Persia because he wanted the legitimacy that the oracle could give him. Okay, terrific. So I will now turn things over to our next speaker, Dr. Jorit Vinci. I never know how to pronounce her name. I'm sorry. How do I pronounce her last name?
Wintjes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I've seen it
No
before.
problem.
I don't know how to pronounce it. Okay, Dr. Jorit Vinci, who is joining us virtually from Würzburg in Germany, and he will be presenting a paper called "The Noblest of Prizes: Notes on the Roman Naval Effort Against the Hulian Incursion of AD 267." I'll turn it over to you.
So, thank you for the introduction. I hope you can all hear me. I'll try to start my presentation. So hopefully now you can all see my presentation. The reason I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hulian incursion of AD 267 is that it can teach us a little bit about the way the Romans organized naval efforts in times of crisis. And this Hulian incursion of AD 267 has attracted a lot of attention in the past, already in the 19th century, because the Hulians not only left a trail of destruction in Greece, but also a trail of various different notes in the available sources, most of them unfortunately highly fragmented. And I'll not try to delve too much into all the other discussions around this event, but rather concentrate on the naval aspect of it. Before we go to the Hulians, let's just very briefly recap what we should know about Roman military organization. In general, military power in the Roman Empire is highly monopolized by the imperial authority. So normally you are not allowed, not supposed to run, say, paramilitary forces. That's usually seen as a highly treasonous affair. But of course, there are some exceptions. Now, the standard model or traditional model of Roman military organization is, as far as land warfare is concerned, that we have the Roman army divided into legions and auxiliaries, and the auxiliaries then again divided into the ally, the cavalry units, mobile infantry, the cohortes equitatae, and the cohortes, the infantry units. That's the Roman army, and then of course the Roman army also goes to the field with its allies, with the Socii, these allies fighting under their own leaders within their own organizational framework outside the organization and administration of the Roman army. So that's the model for the Roman army. And Roman naval forces are organized somewhat similarly. We have big classes, big naval units stationed in Italy, and smaller, much less capable units stationed in the provinces. These big units can be compared to the legions, also as far as their legal status is concerned, whereas these classes are auxiliary units. There are no sort of naval allies in the early and high empire. Now, this traditional model of Roman military organization has been under discussion for quite some time, and there are some events, particularly from the 3rd century, where we can see that there was something else going on in the Roman Empire as well. And this brings me to some probably not really nice chaps who in 260 decided to have a go at northern Italy, the Jutungans. They broke through the Roman frontier and then went into northern Italy, in the process laying waste to a couple of cities, and then they went back to Germany, or tried to go back to Germany, laden with booty and slaves, and they were intercepted in the Roman province of Raetia, that's in southern Germany, by a Roman equestrian officer by the name of Marcus Simplicinius Genialis. He had cobbled together a sort of ragtag force from soldiers from various different sources, and apparently inflicted a great defeat on these Suetonians. Literary evidence for this is exactly zero. In 1992, this victory altar was found, the victory monument that was erected after the battle, and that is the only evidence we have for that. Now, this is a fascinating monument for various reasons, but in our context, the sort of initial lines are particularly important because it is in these lines that the composition of the force fighting these Suetonians is actually mentioned. And in these 3 lines, we can clearly see that Genialis had under his disposal soldiers, here the militibus provinciae Raetiae from the province of Rhaetia and from the German provinces at Germanicianis. There are no legions mentioned, so the general consensus is that he probably had auxiliary forces gathered from these 3 provinces, Rhaetia and Lower and Upper Germany. And then there is the phrase itemque popularibus. And it's interesting to see that we have basically 3 sources for these soldiers: the province of Rhaetia, the German provinces, and the populares, whatever that exactly means. Again, the general consensus is that this means basically armed civilians, or rather men normally tasked, for example, with policing duties, watchmen, perhaps also veterans and things like that. Which means that at least in times of crisis, and for the army, we have to somewhat modify this model so that there was a sort of third element to a Roman military organization, a sort of, well, paramilitary organizations like policing forces, like watchmen, and others, veterans who were capable of being recruited if the need arose. Now, one could easily argue that that is the thing to do if you have to defend yourself against a barbarian incursion. You just gather everybody who is capable of wielding a pointy stick. And indeed, that is probably what was done in Rhaetia at the time. What is interesting now is the question whether we have evidence for similar things at sea, because obviously at sea, things are way more complicated. These populares could range from, say, legionary veterans really down to able-bodied men equipped with a pointed stick, because at the end of the day, that is what a lance in the end is. And you do not need a lot of training and a lot of competence to operate a pointed stick. What you do need is a lot of training and competence in order to operate a warship. So this model is not easily sort of transferred to the naval side of things. And that brings me to the Hulians and their glorious attempt at trying out what later would become known as the Grand Tour. Now, when we talk about these Hulians, and it's somewhat kind of funny that the first paper was on Athens, and now I'm going to talk about how the Hulians utterly destroyed Athens. But when we talk about Hulians, I already said that there is somewhat an issue with the forces. As I'm mostly interested in the naval aspect of that, I'll confine myself to the 2 main narratives we have of their Grand Tour, and they are very short indeed, as you can see. We have one late Roman chronicler, Georgios Synkralos, who mentions what the Hulians did, and then there is a piece in the biography of the 2 Gallieni in the Historia Augusta, fortunately a notoriously unreliable source. But anyway, that's basically what we have, and the construction that I'm going to show you is mostly based on these 2 sources. If we look at what the Hulians actually did, then we find that in early summer of 267, they set out from the Sea of Azov in probably around 500 ships, and it's generally assumed that we are talking about fairly small vessels of no more than 25 to 30 men each, so that we arrive at around 15,000 men. That number is purely conjectural, but I would argue that it is roughly in the correct ballpark. So this incursion was not the whole sort of tribe of Hulians trying to relocate into the Roman Empire. We are not talking about hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. That was a very large raid. Given the damage they caused, that was a raid certainly in the range of, say, something like 7,500 to 20,000 men, something in between that. So I think 15,000 men is probably a good general idea of the size of the force. Now they then merrily sailed down the west coast of the Black Sea, entered the Bosporus, and then attacked Byzantium and Chrysopolis. It's unclear whether they actually managed to sack these two cities. Off Byzantium, they were intercepted by something rather unusual, by a Roman naval force, and we'll come in a minute to why that was actually unusual, under a chap called Venorianus. He actually managed to inflict a defeat on the Herulians, but unfortunately was killed in the process. The Herulians then retreated to the mouth of the Bosporus, a small city called Hieron, and then eventually, under circumstances that are unclear, managed to continue to Cyzicus, which they probably plundered. Just to give you a general idea, on that map, you can see Byzantium, and the number 1 designates where the battle near Byzantium was, and then they continued to Cyzicus. It's unclear what the Roman naval forces did at that period. Possibly they were thrown into disarray. At any rate, they didn't manage to intercept the Herulians, so they went off to Cyzicus and doing their bad barbarian things there. From Cyzicus, they then carried on towards Lemnos and Skyros, 2 islands in the Aegean Sea. They laid waste to these islands and then eventually landed in Achaia. There they destroyed Athens, and by destroying Athens, I mean they really destroyed Athens, basically nearly razing the city to the ground. Our sources also mention activities on the Peloponnese, so it's very unclear whether that really happened. 2 important things are noteworthy here. The one thing is a Roman naval force, likely that which had been commanded by Venorianus, apparently destroyed their ships, and then a local Athenian commander basically gathered local forces, and then again we have these sort of populares, if you want, and inflicted a major defeat on the Herulians. And that is actually the title of my paper is from the pep talk he gave before actually embarking on attacking the Herulians, because that is one of the bits of evidence that has survived. Now, the Herulians, having suffered this defeat and having lost their ships, then decided basically to leg it back home to the coast of the Sea of Azov. Here you can see Athens, number 2 designates the battle near Athens, and then you can already see that they try to basically walk back home. But near the river Nestos, they are intercepted by Emperor Gallienus, and he basically then destroys what's left of the Herulians. So not entirely successful their incursion, but they managed to inflict considerable damage onto the province of Achaia, and indeed, the number 3 designates the final battle. And indeed, if you nowadays visit Athens, you can still see some remnants of that in the shape of the so-called post-Herulian wall, a big wall that the Athenians, when they rebuilt their city, built straight across the Agora, and this wall, as you can see here, reused many pieces of masonry from buildings destroyed by the Athenians. The city, actually, the rebuilt city, was rebuilt on a much smaller scale than it had originally been, as you can see here. In the uppermost bit of the map, you can see this big wall built across the Agora. So they left quite a mark, the Herulians. Now, let's look at the naval side of it. First of all, it's interesting to think a little bit about the actual nature of the Herulian threat, and that includes the nature of the ships they used. We have some evidence for shipbuilding tradition in the Black Sea, and that evidence mostly focuses on the so-called kamarai, a type of vessel about which Strabo talks a little bit, and we have also a nice piece by Tacitus on these kamarai. Essentially, these were sort of larger open boats crewed by sort of 20 to 30 men, fairly lightweight, and these were used by pirates apparently in the sort of 1st century AD, because that's where the evidence comes from. Unfortunately, we have no evidence for the 3rd century AD, which is where the Herulians did their thing. It is generally assumed the ships they used were about this kamarai type, though we cannot be sure because we have no no hard evidence. Just to give you some visual impression of that, that of course is not one of the Kammerai, it's the Naidam ship, a beautiful example of Northern German shipbuilding tradition, and in many ways, constructionally speaking, totally different from these Kammerai. But as you can see in this reconstruction, the Naidam ship is a vessel that is designed for a crew of, say, 20 to 30 men. So this is roughly what you can see here. And if you think of the Hulians, think of a large fleet of hundreds of boats like these. That's basically the nature of the threat. So now how to defend the coast against such a threat? That is pretty easy. And while we do not know whether the Romans actually had handbooks, if they had one, this would probably be under the heading how to defend the coast against a seaborne assault. Because defending a coastline against a seaborne assault is easy. You gather mobile units, preferably cavalry, and then you attack the enemy when he's most vulnerable. That is either during disembarkation or when he goes back to his ships laden with booty, and then you cut them to pieces. This is sort of the standard operating procedure for the Romans when they try to defend their coasts. We can see that in Britain, we can see it in in the Netherlands. That is basically in an age where it's very difficult to locate an enemy at sea. That is how do you defend the coastline. The main problem is if you want to defend the coastline in that way, then you need military units, army units that are actually stationed on that coastline. Now, by going through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the Hulians effectively attacked the soft underbelly of the Roman Empire, because all around the Mediterranean, all around the Aegean, there were no units, no army units stationed. So these terrible men on big horses were simply not available for provincial authorities in Achaia and in the other provinces around the Aegean. So that is the reason why the Romans gathered naval forces in order to interact with the Hulians. Now, Roman naval capabilities in the Aegean were limited. There were no naval units stationed in the Aegean. The nearest naval units was the class of Syriaca, fairly small unit, and that is important here, that probably had suffered severely from the conflict between Rome and the Sassanids, a conflict that had resulted in ancient Antioch being sacked twice, in 256 and possibly again in 259. The class Syriaca was stationed in the harbor of Antioch in Seleucia Pieria, so it's unclear whether in 267 it was operational at all. Other than that, there were no regular naval units stationed in the region. But if we think about the threat and about what Venerianus, the Roman commander, must have had at his disposal, then even if the ships were larger, then we are still talking about a fairly big fleet of, let's say, at least 100 ships or so. And what's important is that all these ships, in order to be able to intercept vessels like those of the Hulians, all these ships had to be warships or at least fast oared ships. Now, imagine you are the provincial governor, let's say, of Achaia. Obviously, there are many harbors around, but most ships in these harbors will be sailing vessels, will be traders, merchantmen, and they are totally unsuitable for trying to intercept or to fight the Hulians at sea. What you need are oared ships, fast oared ships, and these are rarely used for commercial purposes because they are expensive to run. Which obviously leaves the local authorities. And there is evidence, and for time's reason I cannot go into any detail on that, but we have evidence for local authorities in the Aegean throughout the Roman Empire, for example, running, let's say, police boats for local coastal policing, or running oared vessels for toll collection. We also have to assume that there were pilot services for large vessels, at least in the large harbors. And then also the local authorities in these port cities had to tend the waterways. They had to place buoys and things like that. So there was a pool of such vessels available, and these were all organized and run by the local authorities. And in times of need, then the provincial governor could actually say, well, I need a couple of these ships in order to cobble together a force. Now, if we think about these vessels, and let's assume that we have, say, 30 to 50 men per vessel, and that means that these local authorities actually had access to quite some numbers of ships that were either warships or ships that could be converted to warships. there are many harbors around the Aegean, but not many large ones. And if you assume that only large harbors, only important port cities actually had access to these vessels, then we talk about roughly a dozen of these large harbors, most of them actually on the western coast of Asia Minor. Now, let's say Venorianus had a fleet of around 100 ships. That would mean that in each harbor you could find around 10 or so of these vessels on average. And that would mean that on average, a big port city in the Aegean actually ran, well, let's say paramilitary naval forces the size of a small auxiliary unit. We are talking 10 ships, we're talking about hundreds of men that were actually involved in this. So the Hulian incursion actually allows us a small glimpse about what actually went on in these big harbor cities. Which brings me to my, basically to my conclusion. What can we learn from this Hulian incursion? We can learn that we have to, at least to some extent in the Eastern Mediterranean, slightly revise our model of Roman naval organization in that below the level of the classes, we had something like sort of the populares at sea. And these assets were actually of considerable size and apparently of considerable capability. So in conclusion, the Roman response to the incursion of 267 was unusual in that it relied initially on naval forces. It was, on the other hand, there was no other response possible because no army units were available. Venorianus then would have taken these naval forces from ships he had collected in the harbor cities of the Aegean. And obviously there was no time to build ships for the purpose because the sort of pre-warning the Romans had was likely fairly short. So he had to take his ships from local authorities. In turn, that means that local authorities could organize naval forces for various duties. And that is, again, it appears to be sort of self-evident for us, but we are here living in a context in the Roman Empire where military capability, military forces are normally highly monopolized by imperial authority. But what we can see here is that actually local authorities had access to and had control over considerable naval capabilities in the shape of possibly up to a dozen of ships that could be turned into a warship. And these, of course, these vessels then represented a significant investment of money and manpower for these port cities. So, in all, this Hulian incursion of 267 is there's a lot in the shade because the situation of the source is very difficult. But I believe that we can learn quite a bit from it about Roman naval organization. Thank you for your attention. And that would be trying to.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I think what we're going to do is, let me just explain, since we're doing this hybrid model for the first time, let me just explain the procedure. We're going to hold all of the virtual questions until after our last speaker presents, and there is a Q&A feature. This is primarily for the virtual participants here. There's a Q&A feature. So I'm going to ask, if you have questions and you're attending from online, I'm going to ask you to type your question, specify who it's for, first of all. Type your question in the chat box, and then our TAD ensign here will sort of read those off. So the Q&A, I'm gonna open it so that we can sort of populate it with questions, and then we'll come back after our final paper, and you can ask either of the panelists questions that you have. And we'll start with the audience, and then let the people online type their questions, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so our third and final paper, joining us from University of Genoa in Italy, is a paper by Massimo Corradi and Claudia Ciaccella, who is, I believe, a grad student at the University of Genoa. And she is going to be presenting a paper called The Periplus and the Navigation Beyond the Pillars of Hercules. I turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. And first of all, good morning to everyone. I hope you see my screen. Okay, so nowadays navigation is something pretty easy because we have lots of tools that can help us to understand where we are and where we are going, and also what route to follow, and also how many miles we have traveled. But how did ancient navigators orient themselves? Of course, we know that the will of man to face the sea and its dangers has ancient origins. The need for sustenance was the main factor that constantly prompted men to seek new marine areas where develop fishing and undertake new trade routes. So, the sea has always been an essential source of subsistence of population that live on the coast, and navigation thus became a crucial part in the identity of coastal populations. But already the first navigators felt the need to have a tool for planning their future trips based on the experience of the past ones. So they started to take note of their knowledge of seas and winds and their discoveries of new routes, coasts and landings and ports, and also about the populations that they came into contact with. And precisely from this transcription, the purpose was born. So it was a narration of a journey, but it was also one of the main tools for ancient navigators who embarked on adventurous journeys of discovery towards new lands. Probably the origin of the periplus dates back to the 6th century BC, and the word periplus comes from the Greek word meaning circumnavigation. So a periplus was also an ancient naval maneuver through which the triremes during naval combat would have surrounded the defenders to hit them on the rear. The periplus could refer to epic feats, for example, the periplus of Hanno the Navigator and the one of Pythias that we will see better later, but it could also refer to travel stories that were handed down in the classical tradition. It was a manuscript in which captains, explorers, and navigators noted all the information that they considered essential to retrace the same route safely later. For example, the periplus reported the distance covered during the journey, including intermediate distances, although measurements were approximate according to the knowledge of the time. Then reported shapes and typologies of the coast with the visual landmarks that were possible observed, and also the presence of beaches or places to possible hold ships, and also the existence of ports, cities, and populations. And the next step in the evolution of this navigation tool came when the expert geographers added their observations regarding precise measures on daytime and nighttime navigation. In particular, during the 6th century BC lived the Greek Hecateuch of Miletus, who was one of the first writers of history and geography of antiquity, and he is considered by many as the father of geography. The Periegesis, or Tour of the Earth, of which only few fragments remain, is his most important work in geography, and according to Herodotus, Hecateuch was one of the first to draw a map of the Earth, representing a circular disk surrounded by the oceans, probably based on the map of Anaximander. The periplus differs from a historical text in its structure and intent. An example of historical text can be the account by Herodotus of his travels, so the histories of Herodotus. The structure has an intense and well-constructed narration with long digressions regarding the various places and populations that the Greek scholar encountered. The intent of Herodotus was informative. Indeed, he said that he wrote his account so that things done by men not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds not lose their glory. Structure and intent of the periplus were quite different. About the structure, we can say that the periplus was written in the form of a diary that collects impressions, sensation, and knowledge, and so it can be considered as the archetype of the logbook. The intent of the periplus was practical, because it was composed to consolidate new marine routes and also strengthen maritime supremacy during critical historical periods. Indeed, many periplus were written between the 6th and the 1st century BC, so when the Greek-Phoenician opposition between Massalia and Carthage was strong. But the intent of the periplus was also communicative. Indeed, it aimed to make future readers revive the voyages, and so it can also be considered as the beginning of travel literature. Numerous are the periplus that have come down to us, and through their comparison it is possible to see how extensive the commercial networks were and how far the voyages of discovery reached. So, just comparing some of the best known, we can see how between the 6th century BC and the 1st century BC, ancient navigators did the circumnavigation of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and they also went from the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Guinea and to the northwestern shores of Europe and also to the British Isles. And again, between the 4th century BC and the 2nd century AD, they went from the Mediterranean to the Great Britain, Scandinavia to the Baltic Sea, and also from India to the Persian Gulf. And they also sailed coastal routes of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and also trade routes along the coast of the Black Sea. Now we are going to see in detail two of the most famous and important periplus that are the one of Hanno the Navigator to the African coast in the 6th century BC, in the 5th century BC, and the one of Pythias to the North Europe in the 1st century BC. Starting from Hanno, in his periplus, the Carthaginian explorer recounted his adventurous attempt to travel around Africa. The periplus of Hanno is one of the earliest recorded voyages of discovery, so it's really important. The trip of Hanno had a commercial purpose, but it was also an opportunity to create new settlement and thus expand the territory under Carthage control. Indeed, during his trip, Hanno founded many colonies along the coast of Morocco. In total, he sailed more than 4,000 miles. The expedition started from Carthage with 60 pentaconters loaded with food and provision to meet the needs of a long and complex navigation, and according to Hanno, they left with a crowd of about 30,000 people. After 2 days of coastal navigation to the south, he founded the first city, Timiaterium, the modern-day Mehdia, at the mouth of the Cebu River. And after that, he reached a large promontory covered by woods called Soloais and built a temple dedicated to Poseidon. Then he came to a lake not far from the sea, where a great mass of tall reeds grew in which elephant and many other wild animals grazed. Subsequently, he founded numerous other cities along the coast, as we can see in the map, and in total there were 6 colonies. At the mouth of the Lixon River, maybe the Locust River in the north, or more probably the Draa River, he had his first encounter with the local population of nomadic tribe of shepherds. He learned from them of the troglodyte population that live in the hinterland, described as cavemen who run faster than horses, and the numerous beasts that populated those areas. Then Summer embarked with them as local expert interpreters and guides. Continuing farther south, he passed the great expanse of the Sahara and he discovered a small island on which he docked and which he called Kern. Here he founded the last colony. Indeed, the name Kern in Punic means the last home. Then he reached the mouth of the Senegal River and he attempted to go up the river, but it was populated by many wild animals, including crocodiles and hippos, and in the interior land there were very high mountains full of warlike populations who pushed him away by throwing stones and preventing him from landing. So Hanno resumed navigation and departing again from Kern. After 12 days of navigation, he reached Cape Verde in Senegal and stopped on the coast to replenish their provisions. Then in 5 days of navigation, they reached an immense gulf called the Horn of Espero, perhaps the Lagos Lagoon in the Gulf of Guinea. He landed, finding himself surrounded only by forest, and he decided to spend the night there. But during the night, the inner part of this forest lit up with numerous fires, accompanied by sounds of screams and songs of the primitive local populations. So frightened, Hanno and his shipmates left immediately. They continued farther south, skirting a land characterized by torrents of fire that pour into the sea until they reach a peak in flames so high that it seemed to touch the sky, and which was called the Chariot of the God. This was probably the Mount Cameroon volcano, and this is one of the earliest descriptions of an eruption. After 3 days, they arrived to a bay called Horn of the South, perhaps the Bay of Cape Lopez in the present-day Gabon. There Hanno found an indigenous population with very hairy bodies. He managed to catch 3 females, but these turned out to be so ferocious that they had to kill them, bringing home only their skins, and it's really interesting to note that the guides of Hanno called them gorillas. After this story, Hanno wrote that their provision was running short, so he decided to stop the journey and return to Carthage. So this is the end of the periplus and the voyage of Hanno. At the same time, so always in the 5th century BC, Herodotus realized a map of the world according to the knowledge of the time. As we can see, based on the previous trip, he imagined the shape of the African continent, while the northernmost part of Europe was still unexplored by the Greek navigators. And the first Greek to say that part of Europe was Pythias in the 1st century BC, but the first known explorer to reach the northern western shores of Europe is Himilco. Himilco was a Carthaginian navigator who lived during the late 6th or the early 5th century, almost a century before Pythias. And in the 1st century BC, Pythias followed in the footsteps of Himilco by circumnavigating the Iberian Peninsula and Gaul as far as Britain. But Pythias' journey aimed to explore new routes and even increase the geographical knowledge of those parts of the world not yet explored. So during his journey north, Pythias went farther than Himilco. Pythias was a Greek navigator and astronomer who lived at the time of Alexander the Great and Aristotle, and between the 330 and 320 BC, he left from the Mediterranean for the North Sea. He traveled over the Britannia, which he called Britannica in Aesoin, from which the current name derives, that means the island of the man with the painted bodies. And he was the first, at least in the Greek world, to describe celestial phenomena typical of the northern lands, namely the midnight sun and the aurora borealis, the northern lights. The fire of the Alexandria Library was probably the cause of the disappearance of his work, of which today remains only fragments reported by the authors after him. Therefore, his story is known thanks to the Greek and Latin commentators who told his journey, and thanks to it, his enterprises went down in history forever. Pythias left from the Greek city of Massalia, the modern-day Marseille, and once having avoided the Carthaginian naval blockade at the Strait of Gibraltar, Pythias sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules and along the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, France, and the Netherlands. During his long trip, the main reference point had been the polar star that allowed him to follow a route. Then he sailed toward Britannia, and according to his reports, he wrote an accurate description of this land after he crossed the whole accessible region by walking. For example, Pythias visited the tin mines, for which he learned how to work this material. He made numerous geographical observations on the nature of the seas and the skies, and at the end of his long wanderings, he reached a town where during the summer the night lasts very little time. So Pythias was the first to describe the phenomenon of the midnight sun, but also of the tides, the aurora borealis, and the great polar ice. Pythias also mentioned that he had come as far as the mythical Isle of Thule, a land of fire, so probably volcanoes and ice, where the sun never set. During the 1st century BC, Virgin defined it as the last known land, the Ultima Thule, the farthermost Thule. According to Pythias, this land was in the north of the British Isles, and he reached it after about 6 days of navigation. He added that the island was close to a sea, perhaps the upper Atlantic Ocean or the Arctic Ocean, where the navigation was impossible because the sea was made of a mixture of water and ice that looked like a marine log, and here lung appears to refer to a jellyfish of the type the ancients called sea lung, so probably Pythias here is describing the pancake ice phenomenon typical of the northern seas. The geographical location of Thule is still not sure. The question is highly controversial due to the difficulty to determine the exact territory indicated by the narrators. It is perhaps island, but it would also be the description of the more distant Greenland, and modern scholars affirm that the mythical Thule could also be identified with the coastline of the Norway, or with the Shetland Islands, or with the Faroe Islands. Probably at the end of his journey, he also reached the Baltic Sea. Indeed, according to Pliny, Pythias met the population of the Guttons, a people of Germany who inhabited the shores of an ocean estuary called Mentonomo. One day of navigation from these shores was the island of Abalo, on whose coast it was possible to find amber that this population and their neighbors, the Teutons, used as fuel. So as shown in the map, the island may have been in one of those places which were historically the richest sources of amber in the North Europe, but the location is not sure. At this point, also his voyage was at the end, so after having circumnavigated the British Isles, Pythias returned to Massalia. In conclusion, we can say that from these and other periplos, it is clear how this tool represents the passage from a known place to the unknown, the discovery of the mysterious and the unrevealed. The periplos has a narrative that summarizes geography, describing territories, astronomy, and identify the routes to follow, and the ethnography, telling about people and cities. But it is also an epic tale that narrates legendary feats in didactic and literary form, where the scientific description is still veiled by the story. And in the periplos, the desire of discovery reveals the man's will to know the unknown and open new paths to broaden the knowledge of the world around them in all its admirable nature. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to do now is open the floor to the audience that is present for questions, and then if any of you guys who are online have questions for either Dr. Winchus or Claudia, then you can put it in the chat box, and then we will get to those after we see what people here would like to discuss. So any questions for either of our speakers? Yes?
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Winchus, is that the correct way to pronounce it? Dr. Winchus, you made a fair point about how the locals use almost militia forces in conjunction with imperial fleets, but do you think that the naval response was successful and like that whole procedure of how to defend the coast was succeeded in its purpose? Because Athens did burn, and the final victory against the invading tribe was actually on land. So, thanks, sir.
Sorry, now you should hear me. Thank you. That is actually a very good question, and I think the answer is or should be, well, it wasn't really, because while they managed to actually find the Hulians and inflict an initial defeat onto them, and while they managed later to basically destroy their ships, that did not prevent the Hulians from actually getting into the Aegean and causing massive damage. So I think I mean, to some extent, we have to sort of get around the idea that for Roman officers, the best way actually to fight such an incursion is to get them on the way back, because then they are laden with booty, they are lazy, they are probably drunk. I mean, they're barbarians. So then it's simply easier to cut them to pieces. Now, in this case, obviously, the damage they caused was so significant that one has to say the Romans did their best with the limited capabilities they had at hand, but they were not successful. And obviously, one of the questions that are sort of skirted around a little bit is, after this initial defeat, how did the Hulians manage to get past the Romans? So they retreated up the Bosporus, right to the mouth of the Bosporus, so essentially back to the Black Sea, but then they managed to get back into the Propontis and then into the Aegean, and we have no idea how what the Roman naval forces did at that time. So on the whole, I would say no. The Romans were, while they were in the end successful in defeating the Hulians, they were not successful in protecting the shores of the Aegean against this incursion.
Thank you, sir.
Other questions from our live audience? Okay, do we have anything queued up in the chat? Other questions?
I do have one question for Professor Winchus. He mentions that these cities on the Aegean had a number of responsibilities. Surely one of them was to prevent piracy. Wasn't piracy kind of endemic all through the Aegean Sea?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is, thank you very much, because that is actually a very important point. Often when we talk about piracy in the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire, we tend to think of Pompey and his sort of major campaign against the pirates. And then it somewhat eludes us that, of course, this campaign was basically directed against something like, major actors who basically, whole communities living from piracy. But below that level, of course, you had brigandage at sea. small-scale piracy, which was always a problem, particularly in periods where the imperial power was considered to be weak. Particularly in the crisis of the 3rd century, we have very interesting evidence, for example, from Egypt, where pirates attacked ferries in the delta, and so there is must have been a constant attempt by local authorities to keep that at bay. And that, of course, required ships in some way or another. Not large fleets, obviously, but it required at least a couple of ships getting around the nearest coastline, visiting the villages, and simply making sure that no one had any bad ideas. So I think it's a very important point to realize that even in the early and high empire, we still have piracy there, and it falls apparently to the local authorities mostly to keep that at bay. And this, of course, means that the local authorities have to have the capabilities to do so. And as soon as you talk about warships, and that is a point that I keep trying to make always, as soon as you're talking about warships, you are talking about platforms requiring at least 30 to 50 men each. Now, everyone with a Navy background in this room certainly knows that one platform means nothing. You need at the very least 2 in order to have one always operational, preferably more. So all of a sudden, we are talking not about, a dozen city guards, but about a body of around at least 100 able-bodied men. So as soon as we talk about several ships, we talk about fairly large numbers of resources and men actually required to deal with this. I hope I answered your question, but I think it's really a very important point to stress that piracy is a phenomenon that is not absent in the early and high empire, but that simply happens on a fairly low level, but it still requires some sort of regulation, for want of a better word.
Dr. Chariot, I never heard of the Periplus before. Those are some pretty epic journeys. I wonder if you could comment, how common is it to find something like that? Are people in this period making something like that anytime they discover something new, or is it only for the really long sort of discovery journeys like the ones you outlined?
Okay. All the Mediterranean, of course, were traveled, so they knew all these lands. So the new routes were beyond the Pillar of Hercules, but we know that other navigators sailed for shorter distances, and not always they created these periplus. It is true that these 2 periplus, so the one of Hanno and the one of Pythias, are particular because they describe this point, so that the discovery of a new land, and they are both describing a positive trip. So it was not something that anyone who sailed in new routes did this periplus, but it was something very very useful, and these 2 are really particular.
If I can just follow on to that, because that was my observation as well. You did a great job making the case that the periplus were not historical documents, but they're more of a, you said, logbook, and intent was practical. And would you say that it's fair that the difference between a periplus and a historical account like Herodotus, who's more of an ethnographer, is that the periplus was meant to encourage people to follow in their footsteps, whereas and maybe that journey themselves, whereas Herodotus is more of a, so I traveled to all of these crazy places so that you guys don't have to. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
And we also know that the Greek then didn't believe that the Carthaginian went to the Gulf of Guinea, because they described this the sun with a strange orientation, and when later also the Greek went there, then they say, oh yes, it was real. So it was really a demonstration that they went somewhere.
Go ahead. Dr. Ticella, I also have another question about the Parapet system. In your research, do you feel like the system was improved upon as navigation continued, or do you feel like a new system was adopted as the primary way to navigate the waters?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Dr. Ticella, do you feel that the Parapet system was improved upon as navigation continued, or do you think additional sources were used in additional ways of navigation?
Okay, for navigate, no, okay, they also have others too, but they were not many. And you have to think that in the ancient time, the navigation was, I would say almost totally a coastal navigation. So they always, I think, see where they were, just looking at the coast and using landmarks. I know that another instrument important for the navigators was the cross staff. That was this staff with a small stick put in perpendicular, and it was used to measure the angle between the horizon and the celestial bodies. So it was useful in the 5th and 1st century BC to navigate. But I mean, it's different because the periplus, it's not useful when you are doing the route for the first time, but it's useful for the future navigators that want to try this new route.
Question?
So I suppose these are both fascinating papers. Thank you so much for taking the time to give them. I have a question for Claudia, and that is about sources here beyond the textual document. Are there oral sources that go into these accounts, or archaeology that can help inform our understanding of these events? I'm curious about what types of sources you can use to tell this sort of story.
Yes. Okay. We don't have we have the original of the purpose of Hanon, but not the one of Pythias. But anyway, the most important sources are the Greek translators, and then of course in my case, the Italian translation of these, and then of course others studies of the topic. But yes, we use the Greek translation and not the original one.
Other questions or comments? Okay, well, I would like to thank both of our speakers for making this truly an international panel. So let's give everybody a round of applause. And please go forth and enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you, Rose.
Sure, my pleasure.
One thing I wanted to just comment on was when Himilcar, the Carthaginian, got to Cornwall in England, and he discovered tin mines, and they needed it to make bronze. And so that started the Carthaginian contact with Cornwall.